Hey, you guys, it's Kim. Welcome back to The Control Variable. I want to start today's show by telling you a story about love and death and a writer named Maggie Nelson. So, my father died in the winter of 2016. And I kind of fell apart after he died. Couldn't stop crying. For a long time, I really didn't think I would be okay. And somewhere in the thick of it, a friend of mine gave me a book called The Argonauts by a writer I'd never heard of named Maggie Nelson. I ignored it for a while. I was reading Leaves of Grass. That was the only thing that made me feel better. Those lines, we were together. I forget the rest. But at some point, I picked up The Argonauts. And kind of to my amazement, I couldn't put it down. I spent the whole day reading it, just opened up the book and inhaled. I remember Emily Dickinson once wrote, "If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry." And I think that's true about art in general. If you feel like the top of your head has been taken off, that's art. And I felt that way about The Argonauts. Just this incredible sense of expansion, this thrilling expansion. Because The Argonauts wasn't like anything I'd ever read before. It was a story of a cool, smart, funny, sexy, brave, curious woman figuring out who she was, who she really was, and how to live in the world. And not just live in the world, but live in a way that felt good all the way through to her, body and soul. And so it was a love story, and a marriage story, and an art story, and a motherhood story, and a queer story, and a story about bodies, and about God, and about sex, and about activism. A story about everything, really. Kind of this hymn to the whole beautiful, messy world. I cried my heart out at the end. And I'm sure some of those tears were dad tears, because there were always dad tears in those days. But really, it felt like I was crying at what a beautiful, incredible mess this life is. Crying with gratitude that somebody had taken the time and trouble to depict her experience of this beautiful, incredible, messy life for the rest of us, so we could know what it was like for her, feel what it was like for her. Anyway, when I was done, I put The Argonauts down on my bedside table next to Leaves of Grass. And I thought, here are two essential books, Leaves of Grass and The Argonauts. Of course, I wasn't the only person who felt this way. The Argonauts was a New York Times bestseller. It won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award. And Maggie herself became a hero to a lot of people. She was made a Guggenheim Fellow and a MacArthur Fellow. She was basically recognized as one of the great thinkers of our time. So these days, Maggie lives with her husband, the artist Harry Dodge, who is fluidly gendered, and their kids in Los Angeles. She's a wife and a mom and a critic and a poet and a professor. She teaches at CalArts. She's the author of 10 books, 4 volumes of poetry, and 6 books of prose, including the beautiful lyric essay Bluets, and the widely influential work of art criticism, The Art of Cruelty. And from my perspective, the thing that makes Maggie so great, so unusually particularly great, is that in addition to being a deeply brave, curious, brilliant thinker, she's also a brilliant feeler. She's got this huge heart. And she's figured out a way to weave her heart together with her fierce cerebral intelligence in her writing. And that is irresistible to me. Because you feel like she's writing to save her own life and kind of saving yours too in the process. So Maggie's my guest on The Control Variable today. Because her latest book is all about freedom, what freedom means in America these days, and how we Americans practice it, which of course is very relevant to our concerns here on The Control Variable. So the new book is a collection of essays called On Freedom, 4 songs of care and constraint. It's not an easy read, but it's an important read. Because in it, Maggie's not just grappling with America's big theme. She's grappling with questions that I think a lot of us are grappling with right now on a daily basis. What does freedom mean in America in 2022? How do you practice it? And why is freedom understood so differently here by the left and the right? And what I love about Maggie is how fearlessly she takes these questions on, how many different angles she examines them from, and how she refuses ever to settle for easy answers. At one point in the book, there's this one point I want to quote to you because I think this is a really important key to understanding her. She writes, "It seems to me crucial, even ethically crucial, to treat with caution any rhetoric that purports to have all ethical goodness on its side." She's wary of absolutes, and I think she's really smart to be wary of them, because we humans are humans. We're not capable of absolutes. And instead, she's asking, what might a more truthful, more human kind of freedom look like? And how might that freedom help us all live in a more honest, more wholehearted way? So here's my talk with Maggie. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Nice to meet you, Kim.
Nice to meet you too, Maggie. Yeah, a longtime fan of yours. So it's a real pleasure. Yeah. So I wanted to just start with the very basic question of what does freedom mean to you these days?
That's a big question. I think that there's a kind of political imperative at present time to be, as a public facing person, to articulate a vision of a kind of freedom that would stand up against certain rising forces around the world about, a new authoritarianism. As you know, I was just traveling in Europe, and Giorgia Meloni had just won the Italian election, and people were very hungry for that articulation, because I think what you see when people start to offload the freedoms of self-governance onto figures who promise order and stability at the price of self-governance, you begin to see people losing sight of what the freedoms of self-governance include, and they begin thinking that the freedom to congregate, to dress as you like, to, have sex with whom you like, to have protections about what you can say intimately and in public, all of these very basic freedoms suddenly lose some of their luster when people get in the grip of the idea of someone who's going to maybe take away some of these freedoms, but for other people, or, it won't be for me and it will be okay because there'll be a good trade. So I think that on a political level, which of course intersects with the personal, there's a real imperative right now to explain why that is a bad trade, and why it does not grow freedom for people in the end, and why it's a short-term trade that ends in, everything from loss of personal freedoms, all the way through things like imprisonment and genocide and, much bigger things. So I think that that's on that level. I mean, for me, what freedom means to me, like on a day-to-day basis, and a life that is fair, that is relatively quite free compared to a lot of people alive on the planet right now and in history. I think I'm more alive to the subtleties of when things feel constraining and when things feel like there's kind of no way out, and figuring out what is it about either material conditions or my own mindset or some interplay between them that I haven't yet figured out how to flip, and then working with that,
Mm-hmm. And what about in terms of how do you think of the kind of freedom that you want to practice in your life? How would you define it for yourself?
I mean, I think that there are any number of things in a day, from mortality and feeling like you're trapped in a body that's doomed to die, on its most basic level, all the way to I can talk to you until I have to go get, children, and then they have their own demands. And I mean, there's so many things in a day when you begin to feel the frustrations or angers about not feeling like you're making a choice about the way you're moving, or people, I think that's when you begin to say, what's the problem here? And the problem might be capitalism and having to work 4 jobs for some people. The problem might be for other people, not enough help or autonomy in the domestic sphere. There are a million things that can be. So for me, for everybody, it's about trying to figure out where I feel room to move and where I feel constrained, and then trying to diagnose what the stew is, that's making me feel the way I feel, and to see what levers, if any, there are to pull to change the way that if a constraint feels. And then also, if a constraint feels constricting, but also I think the practice of freedom in a daily life, it's a lot of the issues right now might be mental or spiritual, but I think that the more freedoms you have on a practical or pragmatic level, I think the more you have to work to give freedoms away, to try and not give freedoms away, but to try and make them more available to other people. So I think that I also spend parts of my days thinking about not just where am I entrapped, where do I feel free, but where can I spread or grow freedom for others based on the freedoms that I have, which are substantial.
Can you give me, what would some examples be?
Well, I give money to organizations that are anti-carceral projects and that are, things like that, in which people are literally locked into cages and lose their freedom. That's really important to me. Things like that. And then on a different level, just like in interpersonal relationships, working with students or my family or other people, trying to figure out how we negotiate everybody, all the different conflicting desires, and the way people can feel shut down when they have a desire that meets what somebody else doesn't want to do. And how do we work it out? Because that is the stuff of practicing freedom. It's not just running around asserting that you have it, it's understanding that you live in an enmeshment with other people and that your practices of freedom may at times conflict with theirs. And so you have to figure it out.
How do you remember thinking of freedom when you were young? Like, where do you think you got the idea from, and what did that look like to you when you were a kid?
Well, I think when I was a kid, and I do mean a kid, I mean like 10 or 11, I think I was very aware from the start that my conditions of freedom were radically different from, I was very interested in the cause of apartheid. I was very interested in, there were a whole host of injustices that seemed, obvious to me. And that when you're a kid, you just think, what on God's earth? Like, why are people subjugating so many people around the planet? This is crazy, And I think that through anti-apartheid inspiring activism that I saw, or other civil rights related issues, and then through my teenagehood and my early adulthood, which were more devoted to feminist and queer assertions of freedom. The kind of, like in my book, people ask a lot, like, oh, you have this quote about acting as if you're free and not waiting around for the grim self-sacrifice, and people have asked a lot, like, what does that look like? And it looks like Stonewall. It looks like, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day working on South African history, and she was saying it looks like Stephen Biko. It looks like people who act. It looks like when people would see the Black Panthers walking down the street and they would say, oh my God, look at that freedom and dignity. In a culture that wants to deny that, I'm going to, like how, I can do that too. I can model myself that way. So I think when I was little, I noticed all of that. And then I think, like I write in the book, I grew up in the 70s and 80s where.
And you grew up in San Francisco, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So obviously a very liberal city, and a very politically engaged in those times.
Yeah, and I went to a very politically engaged high school, so it was kind of a requirement not to do liberal political work, but to do service of some kind or another. So I started working, quite young, I would say 14 or 15, where I worked regularly with different organizations or doing community service, like with the homeless or the elderly or whatnot. So I think all that was really formative, but it's not, I don't want to overstate it insofar as that I've been very focused on being an intellectual and not an activist in my adult life. So those experiences were formative for me, but they're not like, I don't talk about them. I talk about them because you asked. I don't talk about them because I think of them as like activist street cred or something,
Oh, no, I get it. Totally. No, I really just wanted a larger context. I mean, because I think of what freedom meant to me as a kid. And I mean, there are a bunch of different answers, but definitely a big one that comes up is just like ideas of freedom that were like in the songs I listened to, but also like in the commercials on TV and in the like mainstream entertainment that I inhaled. And that idea of, and as we were saying before, it's not that that a feeling of limitlessness isn't desirable and isn't sometimes awesome. That was fed to me through our culture much more than what you're talking about, which I had, I was well educated. And so I was aware and taught about, different like freedom movements around the world, but just not nearly as intensely as you were, right? Like that was just not something that was present to me in a way.
Yeah. And I would just say, like, on a personal level, it's not that interesting, but maybe to your listeners, it might be, if you're, but as a writer, people who spoke freely, as it were, and who made me think when I heard them, oh, wow, you can say that, everybody who I saw who did that excited me, and made me want to be a writer. And I moved to, the East Coast and started, orienting myself around a downtown spoken word, kind of punk poetry scene full of people, especially like, saying all kinds of things that were really, and it was, again, like you say, it was the age of AIDS. So, and the age of ACT UP. And so seeing the confluence of people in literature and art, many of whom were dying, marrying this kind of uninhibited, disinhibited urgency to say what were their truths in the face of a society that despised them or wished them dead was really, really inspiring to me, and definitely gave me an idea of what acting is if you were free. Even though, this is obviously death, or facing death is one of the most radical forms of freedom. If you talk to anybody in that state, they might tell you that. But I think, it's one of those ironies, like as you're barreling down towards the brick wall, as a lot of people were with HIV diagnoses, spawn some of the freest and angriest and, most transformative expression that, certainly I'd ever read.
Sure. Did you, when in practicing your own expressions of freedom, I wondered what kind of resistance you encountered when you were starting to do that as a young person?
It never ends. I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately, just because it never ends, and how you don't, just like with, like there's a kind of adage in, gay life that like you don't come out once, you have to come out over and over and over again. It's like you don't get free once in your writing, every public event, every interview, every podcast, everything you publish, puts you into a different feedback loop where you may be tested about whether or not people like what you've said, or how to stand your ground while also thinking ethically about what you do say is, I think, a constant negotiation, especially for people who write nonfiction, because it's not like you want to just go around recklessly, like, I'm free, I say what I want to say. It's not like that, but it's also like you have to be alert to all the different kinds of complaint or shame, or that might greet, that has always greeted, especially, women speaking in the public realm. So it goes on, and it's an ongoing thought stream and an ongoing fortification, I think, of the self, so that you can keep doing it and keep making decisions that you stand behind,
Do you feel like there's one experience that sticks out in particular really for you as a time when you felt like you were able to kind of free yourself?
I would just say it wasn't like a moment, but I would say that there was a book that I wrote in the early 2000s called Jane, a Murder. And my aunt had been murdered when she was 23. And I realized in my early 20s, that she both represented in family history like a strong, outgoing woman who was, I think, number 6 or number 8, like the 6th or the 8th, woman to ever be at University of Michigan Law School, and that she wanted to do civil rights law. And that by all accounts, she was a debate champion. She was very outspoken. She was, for my family background, she was incredibly liberal or leftist. She was engaged to a Jewish communist, more or less, which was not happy making in my family. And then she was shot twice in the head by a stranger after she took a ride on a ride board to go home for the holiday. And there was some kind of equivalence that my mind had kind of made about that, okay, be all that, go do all that, but your very brilliant mind that might be the source of all of your success and, brilliance, might be literally be shot, violated by bullets, And I think I didn't really realize that I was carrying that message, that I kind of made that meaning about my aunt's life until I was around her age and facing, in a very different milieu, but facing some concerns about shame or safety, and not safety, just safety of just being alone, living alone in a New York apartment and just going out and saying, going to punk clubs and just speaking your mind. And I had to write that book to face down those fears. And I think by the time I finished the book,
like the fear that you would actually be murdered as a price for your...
Yeah, it would be punishment for female, strong female speech.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think it was just an unconscious feeling that I had, that I moved into my conscious mind while I was writing that book. And then when the book was published, there was a kind of another ring of fire that appeared, because all of a sudden now, after 36 years, they suddenly had a suspect. And my feeling that writing about her, looking into what had happened to her, would somehow conjure harm to me suddenly seemed like it had then now been materialized, where somebody, literally a detective, called and said, "This is crazy, but we have a DNA match in your aunt's case. He hasn't been arrested yet. He's at home with his family, but we wanted to let you know." Meanwhile, my book has just come out from the printers, and my worst fear, which is I'd be like giving a reading, because her murder was not solved. So my worst fear, that I was giving a reading and the person who had actually done it might reemerge, suddenly seemed to be, coming true in a certain way. And so then I had another ring of fire, which I of course met with more writing. So I was like, okay, this is hard. Let's go. I'll go to the trial with my mom, and we'll face down this person, and not face him down like in a confrontation. We'll just be in the courtroom, and I will write about it, and I will write about it. And this will be a new challenge. Can I write about it not with this imagined boogeyman, but with the actual, he was convicted. I don't know. He's deceased now, but he always maintained his innocence. Anyway, this is a long story that maybe you didn't bargain for.
Oh no, it's great. I remember it so well I remember you wrote about it in the Argonauts in a way that I'm literally like, as you're talking, I'm remembering that incredible line, which I think is from that section where you say like, there's nothing we can't metabolize.
Oh yeah. Nothing we can't alchemize. Yeah. Yeah, I can try and find it if you want me to, but I think it was basically like, this kind of faith that there is no badness that can't be alchemized.
Right, that it can't be alchemized, exactly.
Yeah, through bravery. But what was very important to me was that, like, I used to think, like, in my youth, I thought that meant you will alchemize it and it will be a protection, like nothing bad will happen to you.
Yeah, no.
And then I realized, the bad thing might still happen to you, but you still alchemized it. You still did it. You still made it. And I think when I realized that, then I thought, I'm not writing or becoming a public person because I think I'm going to weave some, miraculous magic web around me that will protect me. I'm actually doing it because it, in and of itself, it's not protection from anything. It is, the acting as if you were free. It is the living embodiment of it, no matter what happens to you. And that was, so all that time, which took about a decade between Jane and then the red parts, that whole time, which ended around, I guess the red parts came out in 2007. I think it changed me a lot as a person, and I faced down a lot of things I was afraid of. It's not that I don't get afraid again, but it was a kind of trial, for me.
Sure. In a way, it's almost like, you're right. It's not necessarily that you're changing what can or can't happen to you in the exterior world. It's more that you're transforming your interior experience, your interior relationship with your own psyche in a way.
Yeah. And it's transforming it to say, instead of the message that a lot of young girls get, and which I certainly got with I don't blame her, but, my mother, had lost her sister to a violent death by a stranger by being more, out in the streets. And so to transform that message from, hey, if you do all these things right, you can possibly protect yourself from this bad fate, to transform that message to like, well, whatever happens, it was worth it. Basically, I lived like, was a big deal for me. And because I was a very fearful youth. I wasn't so fearful that I didn't live recklessly the way that teenagers do, but it was accompanied by a lot of anxiety.
Okay. So your new book is called On Freedom, and it's 4 songs of care and constraint. So it's a collection of 4 essays, which I really loved. And I wondered when you realized that you wanted to write a book about freedom specifically.
That is a good question. Like all things with writing, you can track multiple routes. I think in the beginning of On Freedom, I talk about, I think I was born in 1973. So I think, I can track one route to growing up like post the 60s movements and kind of wondering why the word freedom wasn't being used the same way as the movements that I seem to read about and care so much about. So there was a kind of, Reagan era smashed up against the civil rights era deep root. But I think that in more immediate roots, and I wrote about this also in the book, that I have a lot of different like strands of my writing life. Like, and I write a lot of different kinds of books, but they tend to, I think of certain of them as like trilogies, or certain of them as picking up where others left off, but they're not all necessarily in consecutive order. So I think that the Argonauts was a little bit like having to do with certain forms of freedom, but it wasn't really thematizing that super directly. It was more about, a discourse of care in a way, which is something that this book takes up as well. But I think that the book I'd written about cruelty, called The Art of Cruelty, which was the kind of third in a series of books about violence, starting with 2 books about my aunt's murder, and then this book about cruelty and representation, had really got me interested in the ways in which, cruelty, but maybe specifically violence, foreclose possibility. I mean, quite literally, like take away the possibility of a life or a future, or via trauma kind of alter the shape of how somebody's life might otherwise have unfolded. And I think I just got really interested in how people, flipped the switches of that, how they continued to find ways of freedom despite, many of the circumstances in and around us. So I think I started taking notes then about watching the word freedom. And this is kind of before, in the United States, when is the word freedom not hot in discourse, right?
Totally. But it's gotten a lot, obviously, the whole thing's kind of escalated. It's gotten
a lot hotter, but that hotness that it got in relationship to kind of rising autocracy and stuff, and the stuff that you've, researched with January 6th and whatnot, that all happened like midway while I was writing, and so I think when I started the book, I was actually more concerned with like big tech and surveillance and kind of some issues coming out of like the Abu Ghraib era and like the Patriot Act. And that's to show how far, how kind of different things were now that you have like today, a judge determining like national security of no issue, so things have really changed a lot. But I knew all along, I think, that instead of writing a political theory book or anything really rooted in politics proper, like meaning kind of the art of governance and power, that I was really interested in the 4 realms I chose, which were, drug use and addiction, conversations in the art world, conversations about sexual freedom, and then the kind of ideas of freedom that surrounded the climate change and its effects and debates.
I love that you've written songs instead of essays, and that you talk about living in terms of dancing. And specifically, you say the idea that we are all actually enmeshed, and the question is how we dance within that enmeshment. When I think about how to live, I also, for as long as I can remember, have thought in terms of singing and dancing. I think there's a daily question of how to live in my head that's just always going, and it's always thinking about how to dance and how to sing it. Mm-hmm. And I wonder why do you think that is for you?
Mm-hmm. When I use the word dance in that sentence, I think I'm actually thinking in some ways of Nietzsche and like the way he used the word dance. I think even when people like disagree wildly with proclamations of his and his philosophy, this kind of call to have the activity of philosophizing be something passionate and something more like a dance, and it's inspiring or like entrancing and exciting for people to think about that. So I think that. But I guess the reason why I say Nietzsche is I don't think Nietzsche danced very much. And I don't think that, that's why I asked you, I don't think, he was known for, horrifying headaches and, bad health and writing in bed. And I don't know, but I think that there's like a space in which these ideas hold for us, like that maybe we actually can feel ourselves dancing, metaphysically or something, as it were, in addition to those people who are lucky enough to have singing and dancing be a regular, literal part of their lives, I
mean, dance involves feeling, right? It's kind of, to dance is different from like walking, or it's a very specific kind of movement that involves feeling, and that's actually, I think, maybe dictated by feeling. And so in a way, it's like, but because how, I don't know about you, but I feel like I can know things intellectually, but it's not until I know them in my body. It's not until I feel them that I really can incorporate them into my life. And
Yeah.
then so I wonder if maybe dancing is a way, means if you can dance something, it means you've learned it well enough that you can you can live it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also one can dance alone. Certainly, I probably dance alone more than I dance
Me too.
anywhere else. Yes, yes, exactly. But I think, it involves a certain negotiation, like certainly of dancing with like a partner, but even with like a space, like even if you dance alone and you're like hitting the chairs in your room or whatever, like there's a kind of, as soon as you start to, as you say, like kind of be embodied and move, suddenly you're in a situation. And I think that is how I do imagine enmeshment, and, what one part moves and something else moves along with it, because it's connected to it. And so we begin to negotiate. Oh, my ankle hurts, or oh, I hit that chair, or oh, my partner wants to pull me this way, or oh, I'm humiliated because people are watching me. Whatever it is, we just begin to negotiate.
Yeah, so it's like you're dancing and you're mindful at the same time, right? Right? Like it's both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
That it requires mindfulness. I was a deadhead in college. I mean, I'm still a deadhead, but I was like I went to a lot of Grateful Dead concerts. And I learned how to be in my body from dancing to the Grateful Dead. I learned how to dance too. I don't think I ever had any comfort with dancing before that. But there's a thing at Dead shows where basically it's like everybody gets like 3 feet around you, like a 3-foot circumference around you. And then within that 3 feet, you can do whatever the fuck you want. But that you just, that you don't really go outside of that. And you learn very quickly not to go outside. Like you can feel incredibly free within a 3-foot circumference. And I actually think of that quite often in terms of how to live in 2022.
Yeah. I mean, I think we share that I have danced at a Dead show in my time, but I've also, I did dance some. I mean, now this is just getting abjectly, biographical, but I did dance in college, and I went to New York to kind of, in part to be a dancer.
Oh, you did? What kind of dance did you do?
I mean, I guess you would call it postmodern dance, and a lot of improvisatory dance, a lot of contact improvisation. And I loved it. I loved it. And I think, like you, I actually think about the lessons of dance almost as much or more than I think about all the lessons I've had in writing. I think it's very, it's kind of formative. And actually dance, I mean, I can remember one of my favorite dance teachers who was a really brilliant and well-known contact improviser. I waitressed, for a long time in New York, and so did she. And I remember her saying, well, of course we do, because we love to move in a room, and waitressing is a great way of practicing moving through people in a room. And I realized that is why I love waitressing. I loved it. Like, I didn't love every minute of it, but I loved that aspect of it. And I realized that, kind of like you talking about, I think about that kind of moving through space and negotiating people and trying to get a job done when there's all these kind of, things falling on you, or impediments or spill possibilities. It's very interesting.
Well, it becomes rhythmic too when you're waitressing, right? I mean, I haven't done that much of it, but I remember that when I wasn't that good at it, but I remember when I felt good at it, it was because I was kind of like slaloming through the room, right? Like you.
Yes. I mean, so does dance, right? Like in dance, your teachers are always going to tell you, do the arabesque till you fall, because you have to know when the point is, like, of the balance point. You can't find it unless you fall, and you're like, oh. But like waitressing, that line between being deep in the weeds where you've lost control of the room and you're just like, oh my God, like, unless time passes and we fast forward till midnight, I'm never going to get out of this alive. Like, the difference between that and being just on the side of it where you're miraculously like, I dropped the sweetened loaf, or margaritas, where you're like, it's so thin, but it's very beautiful, as like a thing to ride,
So I have David Gray. You quote David Graeber saying that revolutionary action is the defiant insistence on acting as if one were already free. And this really excited me. And it really made me think. And so my question was, why does that seem so central to a new way of thinking about freedom? Why does acting as if one were already free? Why does that seem so important?
Because in a kind of philosophical sense, but also in probably a phenomenological or like physical sense, we do create our reality. And what is being free? Who is the arbiter of who is free? And what, is it a mental state? Is it a physical state? Does it depend on how many rights you have enumerated? There are all these ways over time in history that people have, tried to describe the conditions of a free life, and But people who tend to make change are typically people who act in a way that's in defiance of what some of those people have told them are their conditions, and that claim making, not just them making it, but when you see other people do it, it's very contagious. Now, this can have, as you well know, I think, negative contagion in terms of like seeing people storm the Capitol or seeing, there can be these kind of contagions of, oh, you can do that, But I think when it's put towards goals that I value, solidarity, justice, like equality, it is the moving force, and Graeber is somebody who I think I'm not an anthropologist at all. I know, and I'm very American centric, but when you're someone like Graeber or people who've studied a lot of other cultures, many times people who have lived under far more less democratic regimes than the one we currently inhabit, even though I know people are justly concerned. But I think, even when like this last summer I went to Greece and Roe had just been overturned and I was so devastated. But what was interesting is a couple people with whom I spoke with almost were like, oh, it's so quaint that you believe in your state. Like, it's so quaint. But what I heard in that was the same thing that Graeber has written about a lot, which is the ways that people in authoritarian regimes or in different contexts act as if they're free, not in determined, like, go out on the street in Russia and hold up your sign, but just like, just kind of like find a way to live outside of the confines of what the state, and that people get into these kind of modalities of like general ignoring of what the regime has laid down, and that people kind of buy into it together and make something possible. Now, of course, that's not anything anyone's going for. I like my quaint belief in a state that's not anti-democratic, but I think that what people like Graeber have studied is the power of that kind of grassroots individual and communal acts of resistance and acting as if you're free. And I think it's good to keep your eye on them insofar as and I don't think that this is a bad thing. I think that they have to work together. But a critique that often gets made of the left is that they're, entirely focused on detailing, or if you're like a anti-woke person, you'll think that they're exaggerating all the ways in which we're not free, right? So it becomes really dicey to try and bring our attention to, as Foucault had it, recognizing the places where you may be freer than you think. It becomes very dicey to do that if and when it seems like it's in collaboration with people who are gaslighting you and telling you that there aren't, systemic or somatic conditions that produce feelings of unfreedom, which are utterly real. So I think, and that was why those were the kind of some of the shoals this book was trying to, get its ship through, which was to say, like, and I think Graeber is somebody who's very important to read in that regard. For that reason, the Marxists, the anarchists don't get along because the anarchists are always looking for that, and the Marxists are kind of busy often with the analysis of the conditions of unfreedom, and Graeber came into conflict with that, all the time. So,
do you still despair at times?
I think of despair as a mood, which I think if it's all pervasive, it ceases to feel to you like a mood, and it begins to feel to you like a reality or a utterly constant. I think I see it as a mood, and it's definitely a mood I visit, but I don't see it. I see it as a station of many, and I think I know that it will not be the only thing I feel in a day, So I have to. As I think I say in the book, despair strikes people as having a truth value that positive affects do not. And I think, Eve Sedgwick, queer theorist, and some other people whom I really admire, asked a lot of really fascinating theoretical questions about, like, why does joy have no truth value for people? Like, why does despair have the truth value for people? And I think, there are kind of interesting neurological reasons for that. You'll often hear it said, like, our brains are Velcro for pleasure and Teflon for pain. I'm sorry, Teflon for pleasure, Velcro for pain. Like, we hold, that we may hold on to trauma, different things may imprint differently than pleasure or joy. But that is why I find it so important to import into your life. That's what like gratitude journals are, things like that. But like, if that is the case and you're kind of like up against a neurological force that might give despair a truth value or something, then you have to come up with ways to counteract that. And I think that becomes the job. So it's not like, and you're never going to banish a feeling of despair. I mean, how could you? And like, stay human,
Does writing help you with that? Did writing this book help you in terms of climate despair?
It did. I will say it did. I think that for a lot of people, and I talk about this in the book, this kind of, and I actually believe this is true of the climate deniers as well. I think that there's like a low grade burning, maybe to medium, and for some high grade feeling of chaos, nihilism, concern, about the climate and about the way that we're living that's really bothering like most people, like everywhere. And I think now it has like names, like people are, describing it more. When I was writing this chapter, there wasn't that much of a kind of conversation about the affective issues of like therapists going into work with climates, but it was kind of starting. But I think I do think, and this is just the way I am as a person, so I don't know if there's like a general rule that holds here, but I think for me that kind of low grade burn is worse if I don't ever turn and like face
me too
the thing that's on fire.
Because my imagination will do so much worse than actually looking at anything.
Where you're just on the run, like you're on the run. That if you stopped, you'd have bad feelings. So you're just kind of like a little bit like on the lam from yourself, So I think writing that chapter was a way of being like, okay, like I'm on the run from this, because every time I think of it, I either like hyperventilate or cry or get really like, well, fuck it, nothing I can do about it anyway, So it was like I was just watching myself ricocheting between those extremes, neither of which felt very good for me or good for anybody else. And so I think, as McKibben and other people will say over and over again about trying to draw us towards the collective, like my own individual sense of change while writing a chapter that, a teeny minority of humans will read or care about is not really the point. But I do feel like turning yourself, like shifting that in yourself, like I do a fair amount of public events, and I teach and I parent, and like all the ways I shifted things for myself, I do think it's enabled me to talk about these things with my students and with my kids and differently. And I do think that matters. It's not that you see the fruit of why it matters, but certainly you will disseminate and bleed out of you certain attitudes. And I think it's really despicable. Speaking of lobbing ethical badness on, I think it's, it really bothers me, I should say, when people just like my age or older just act like, I think McKibben even talked about this. Oh, the kids will solve it. I just like, and kind of take no responsibility for what their own both behavior, but also what they're pumping out. Because I often wonder if it's the so-called mental health crisis amongst like adolescents and teens is really, it's not isolated to them. It's also what they're being fed by the people who care for them. So there's a really important loop there that has to be addressed. You don't detach at all, I don't think, from like the struggles of your time. But, my son's really into Star Wars, and so I've watched, all of them 100,000 times. And it's a cliche, but I think, and it's actually a cliche, I think maybe Zainab Tufiki, like someone else has used this too, but you realize eventually, like, you blow up the Death Star, they build back the Death Star. You blow up the Death Star, they build back the Death Star. Like, that's how it goes, right? Like, the Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, the Empire Strikes Back. And like, when you kind of realize that we're not going, things can be made better, and things can be made better for longer periods of time. But when you kind of realize that this idea of like defeating the autocratic impulse in human beings, or like defeating, rapacious corporate greed, it's not going to happen in the thorough way that you think, which is it's not really bad news. Maybe the corporate greed part, but like, it's not all bad news, but it requires a different, as you're saying, like a different orientation to the battle. And eventually, which I think, many civil rights activists or other people, you can be despondent about where you're at and where things have come to. But I think most people, in kind of inspiring interviews at the end of their life, like they understand that they're passing the work on and that the work is never done. These are all cliches, but I think as you said before, the difference between knowing that and like feeling it in your body, it's very profound to realize, because what you're actually reckoning with is like the story goes on without you. And as I say on freedom, and the story is never ending, and that has, again, like a really lovely humility to it. I mean, who's to say if we don't get ourselves out of this mess with climate change and all the rest of it that, we'll start using some weird crystal that we'll discover in 150 years is like totally poisoned the crust of the earth. We're going to have to do it all. I mean, it's like, it's not going to resolve.
This is kind of a different shift, which is you ask, what can and will happen to our conception of freedom when we begin thinking it, feeling it, living it apart from so many of our current fetishes and habits? And I love this. And at the same time, I immediately think like, okay, but how are we to get away from our current fetishes and habits when advertising and entertainment and social media are relentlessly like throwing gasoline on them?
Well, I have two thoughts. Like, one is that I think that even though social media and many forces that we're up against, like, and there are many people who are saying, whether it's fentanyl or Twitter, like, we're up against things we've never seen before. And like, and it may be true that certain forms of addictive grip are formidable adversaries. But I tend to take, as a student of humanities over the last couple millennia, like, I tend to take a longer view and to feel as though, many, many generations have felt as though, the now works against our capacity to choose our habits in its face, And, I had a teacher when I was in college, Annie Dillard, I don't know if you know Annie Dillard's writing, but, Annie has this passage that I always really loved. I think it's in Living Like Weasels and Teaching a Stone to Talk, but she says something like, it's very simple, but she says something like, we can live any way we want, She says, we can take vows of chastity. We can live with, we can take, and just this kind of notion, like, we can live any way you want, like just reminding you gently that you can make choices. I mean, that's why like sobriety is very like meaningful to me, is like, just as very like, you can live another way, it doesn't mean it's like easy to, but you can. So I think that's my first thought. My second thought about the fetishes and habits and thinking about freedom, I think it's like, sometimes you can't put the cart before the horse. Like, sometimes you can't know what the new way will be until you feel it. And like, I mean, this may sound very cheesy, but maybe it won't to your listeners, but like, I have an electric car, and I know a lot of people who have electric cars, and a lot of people I've talked to have reported, and I was a reluctant electric car getter in a way, because I had all my same reservations, that people have. And, but a lot of people have said to me like, wow, when I'm sitting in traffic or when I'm driving to work and I don't feel like I'm polluting the environment and have this kind of like press of guilt, I feel so free. I feel good, and I think like, that might have been an unexpected feeling, that now somebody's feeling like I'm liberated from this thing that was like weighing on me, but I didn't even really know that every day I sat in traffic, I was like, oh my God, in addition to being in traffic, I'm ruining the planet, and I think, I guess all of which is to say, like, I just think we don't know yet. I just think that there are going to be new forms of freedom that we may not know about until we make certain changes, but they will be there.
That to me is like, that is so inspiring. Because that's such a concrete example of a word literally getting redefined and re-understood by someone just through making a different choice. So that was Maggie Nelson. Not an easy thinker, but an exciting one, I think. Because like I said before, I think the kind of freedom she's interested in is not so much an absolute freedom as a human freedom, like a sustainable, realistic freedom. This is the other thing I love about her. At the same time, she's not denying the serious pleasures that more limitless kinds of freedom can provide. Like those absolute freedoms, she's not saying you won't feel deeply, wonderfully free if you drink 3 margaritas and like chase them with a line of Coke. She's saying that may not be the kind of freedom you want to dive into too often. That there are other kinds of freedom too, like driving your car slowly around LA and taking the time to notice the scenery and how good it feels not to have to worry about how much gas you're wasting, like the fact that you're torching the planet. I like that. It feels true to me, both the margarita part and the electric car part. And this idea that we get to choose what kind of freedom we'll practice in our lives, that we're free to choose. And that understanding the way we do now, what this drive towards limitlessness, this drive towards absolutes, is actually costing us in terms of rampant waste and widespread addiction, that we may want to live in a more mindful, more human way going forward, and that might actually feel better, freer in the long run. I feel like I spent so much of my life trying to be a perfect person, but Maggie knows there's no such thing as a perfect person. She knows we humans are complicated, that we're all made up of light and dark, all flawed. And she's interested in how we flawed creatures, we beautiful, messy, light and dark creatures, might start to think about a more manageable, more human kind of freedom, and how we might learn to be free in that way. And that feels like a really good question to me. So I'm sad to say that this is the last episode of The Control Variable for now. I've loved making the show with you guys, and for you guys, talking to you about this beautiful, messy country of ours, how we got here, how we might start to move forward in a better, more wholehearted way. I've loved talking to you about the dance of responsibility and about freedom and about patriotism and about light and dark and this wild life of ours. And I think the thing that I've been thinking about most recently is that very American idea of the pursuit of freedom, and that maybe the point isn't so much the pursuit of freedom as it is more of a dance of freedom. Like this dance where we're not so busy chasing our American dreams and our American fantasies as we are just being in our bodies, just like dancing in the moment and paying attention to the incredible miracle of this world and this life that's all around us all the time. I want to thank our wonderful executive producer, Jonathan Wilson, for making the control variable possible. In the dark months after January 6th of 2021, Brian Blatstein, Jonathan, and Rob Okendo came to me with an idea for a podcast that was impossible to resist. And I'm so proud of what we created together. Thank you for all of your faith and support. Thank you, Brian, especially, for being there with me and cheering this project on every step of the way. None of this would have happened without you. I also want to thank my incredible team for all their hard work this season. Megan Petta, our amazing researcher and cruise director, for keeping the whole control variable ship afloat. Derek Michaud and Alex Aerosmith at Shelby Rowe Productions for editing the podcast and making me sound good. Eric Tortora Patu for making the social media magic possible. And Kelly Stakopoulos and Steve Camilio, our fact-finding fiends. You guys, all of your hard work and dedication to this project amazed me every day. And finally, and most of all, I want to thank you guys out there for listening to the show we put together and had so much fun making. Thank you all so much for your love and support. All right, you guys, that's it for now. I'm Kim Cutter. Thank you so much for joining me on The Control Variable. See you soon.